Gideon Nash had written 3 letters in his entire adult life. The first was to order seed from a catalog. The second was to the bank about his mortgage. The third was to request a bride through the territorial mail service, because 35 years of solitude had finally broken something inside him that he couldn't fix alone. When Magnolia Pierce stepped off the wagon that September morning, she looked exactly as she had described herself: blonde hair, green eyes, 22 years old, and clutching a small leather satchel like it contained her entire world. What she hadn't mentioned in her letters was how she would look at his weathered hands as if she had traced every scar with her fingertips before, or how she would glance at the kitchen window and smile, as if she knew about the crack in the bottom corner that he had never bothered to fix, the one that leaked cold air every winter morning when he made his coffee. But when she reached for his hand to shake it in greeting, everything stopped. Her fingers found the exact spot where his thumb had been crushed by a falling timber 2 years ago, the place that still ached when storms approached. She pressed there gently, knowingly, and said his name like she had been saying it for years. Gideon jerked his hand back, staring at this woman who was supposed to be a stranger. Because nobody knew about that injury. He had been alone when it happened, alone when he set the bone himself, alone when he learned to work around the permanent stiffness. He had mentioned none of this in his letters to her, yet somehow, standing in his front yard with dust settling around her worn boots, Magnolia Pierce knew exactly where it hurt. The silence stretched between them like barbed wire, sharp and dangerous. Gideon's hand still tingled where she had touched him, and he found himself studying her face for any sign of recognition, any clue that might explain how a woman from 3 territories away could know about an injury he had hidden from everyone, including his only neighbor Otis Caldwell, who lived 5 miles through the canyon and visited maybe twice a year. Magnolia didn't seem bothered by his reaction. She adjusted the satchel on her shoulder and looked past him toward the house, her green eyes taking in details that made Gideon's chest tighten with unease. She noticed the loose board on the porch steps, the one that creaked when you put weight on the left side. She saw the rain barrel positioned under the broken gutter spout, and the way the front door hung slightly crooked because the frame had warped during the last big storm. These weren't things you could see from her letters. These weren't things anyone could know unless they had lived here, walked these boards, fought these daily battles against a house that was slowly losing its war against time and weather. "Your home is exactly as I imagined," she said, and there was something in her voice that made Gideon's stomach drop. Not surprise, not the nervousness he had expected from a young woman meeting her future husband for the first time. Instead, there was familiarity, like she was greeting an old friend after a long absence. "How exactly did you imagine it?" Gideon's voice came out rougher than he intended, suspicion sharpening each word. Magnolia turned back to him, and for just a moment, her composed expression flickered. Something passed across her features, quick as shadow, before the careful smile returned. "From your letters, of course. You described it so well." But Gideon remembered every word he had written to her. 3 short paragraphs total, mostly about the practical aspects of running a ranch, the loneliness that ate at a man like acid, and his need for companionship. He had mentioned his house only once, calling it adequate shelter, because flowery descriptions weren't in his nature. He certainly hadn't described the loose board or the broken gutter or the way morning light slanted through the kitchen window just before dawn. The wagon driver cleared his throat behind them, eager to unload her trunk and continue his journey before dark. Gideon paid him without taking his eyes off Magnolia, watching as she moved toward the house with steps that seemed too sure, too comfortable for someone seeing the place for the first time. When she reached for the door handle without hesitation, turning it with the exact amount of pressure needed to keep it from sticking, Gideon realized that whatever game was being played here, he didn't know the rules. Inside the house, Magnolia moved like water finding its natural course. She set her satchel on the kitchen table, the only table Gideon owned, and immediately walked to the cabinet where he kept his coffee cups. Not the obvious cabinet above the stove, but the narrow one beside the window, the one that looked like it should hold cleaning supplies, but actually contained his meager collection of dishes. She selected 2 cups without opening any wrong doors, without the fumbling search of someone unfamiliar with the space. Her movements were too precise, too confident, and Gideon felt something cold settle in his stomach as he watched her navigate his private world like she had been living in it for years. "I thought we might have coffee while we talk," she said, already reaching for the pot on the stove. "You always make it strong, don't you? Like your father used to." The words hit Gideon like a physical blow. He had never mentioned his father in his letters to her. had never mentioned his father to anyone, because Jacob Nash had been dead for 15 years, and the memories of how the old man took his coffee were buried so deep that Gideon himself rarely thought about them anymore. "Who told you about my father?" His voice was barely controlled now, each word edged with something dangerous. Magnolia paused, her hand frozen halfway to the coffee pot, and for the first time since stepping off that wagon, she looked genuinely surprised. You must have mentioned him in one of your letters." "I didn't." Gideon stepped closer, and she backed against the counter, the first sign of nervousness he had seen from her. "I've written exactly 3 letters in my adult life, and I remember every word. I told you about the ranch, about needing a wife, about the loneliness. Nothing about my father, nothing about how he took his coffee, nothing about the scar on my thumb or the broken gutter or the way this door handle sticks." Her green eyes darted toward the window, then back to his face, and he saw something there that made his blood run cold. Not confusion, not the innocent bewilderment of someone falsely accused. Instead, he saw calculation, like she was deciding how much truth to reveal. "You're frightening me," she whispered, but her voice was steady and her hands weren't shaking. "Good," Gideon said, "because you've been frightening me since you stepped off that wagon." The afternoon light was starting to fade, throwing long shadows across the kitchen floor, and Gideon realized that night would fall soon. He would be alone in this house with a woman who knew impossible things about his life, a woman who moved through his private spaces like she owned them, who spoke about his dead father like she had known the man personally. Outside, he could hear the wagon disappearing into the distance, taking with it his last connection to the normal world, the world where strangers were actually strange and mail-order brides didn't know family secrets that had died with the people who made them. The coffee grew cold between them as darkness crept through the windows. Gideon hadn't moved from his position near the door, blocking her only exit, while Magnolia remained pressed against the counter like a trapped animal. But trapped animals usually look desperate, and she just looked patient, like she was waiting for him to figure something out. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "Perhaps I should explain. That would be a fine start." Magnolia reached for her leather satchel, and Gideon tensed, but she only pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn at the creases. She held it out to him, and when he made no move to take it, she set it on the table between them. "That's your letter," she said. "The real one, not the one you think you sent." Gideon stared at the paper like it might bite him. "I sent 1 letter to the mail-order bride service. 3 paragraphs. You sent 2 letters, Magnolia said quietly. "The second one came a month later. You were drunk when you wrote it, I think. It was different." The words hit him like cold water. Gideon tried to remember a month after sending that first letter, tried to recall what he had been doing, what kind of state he might have been in. Late October, the anniversary of his father's death. The same week every year when the loneliness became something sharp and vicious, when he would sit at this same kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey and let the grief tear through him like wildfire. He had no memory of writing a second letter, but he had no memory of most things from those dark nights, when the whiskey made him sentimental and stupid, and likely to do things he would regret in the morning. "What did it say?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Everything." Her green eyes held his steadily. "About your father's coffee. About the injury to your thumb when the beam fell on the new corral. About how you talk to yourself when you think no one can hear. About the way you count fence posts when you're trying not to think about being alone. About the dreams that wake you up screaming some nights." Each word was a violation, a theft of privacy so complete that Gideon felt physically sick. If he had written those things, if the whiskey had made him confess his deepest shames to a stranger, then he had betrayed himself more thoroughly than anyone else ever could. "I don't believe you," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Magnolia nodded toward the letter on the table. "Read it. It's in your handwriting." But Gideon couldn't move, couldn't bring himself to reach for that piece of paper that might contain his soul laid bare in drunken scrawl, because if she was telling the truth, then everything she knew about him came from his own mouth, his own desperate need to be known by someone. Anyone, even a stranger 3 territories away. And if she was lying, then the truth was something far worse than he had imagined. Gideon's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The letter sat on the table like evidence of a crime he couldn't remember committing, and the thought of reading his own words, Words that had spilled out of him in whiskey-soaked desperation made his stomach churn with shame. "Keep it," he said roughly. "I don't want to see what kind of fool I made of myself." "You weren't a fool," Magnolia said, and there was something gentle in her voice now, something that made him look at her more carefully. "You were hurting, and you needed someone to know that you existed, that your pain mattered to somebody." The understanding in her tone was worse than mockery would have been. Gideon turned away from her, staring out the dark window at his own reflection, ghostly and hollow-eyed in the glass. Outside, his land stretched away into darkness, hundreds of acres of solitude that had been his refuge and his prison for more than a decade. "So you came," he said, "all this way, to marry a man who spilled his secrets to a stranger like a child crying for his mother. What kind of woman does that? The kind who understands what it means to be alone." He turned back to her, and for the first time since she had stepped off that wagon, Magnolia Pierce looked vulnerable. Her careful composure had cracked, and beneath it, he saw something raw and familiar. The same desperate hunger for connection that had driven him to write that first letter, and apparently the second one as well. "You're running from something," he said, and it wasn't a question. She nodded slowly. "My father died last spring. Left debts. The men he owed money to aren't the type to wait patiently for payment. So you answered a desperate man's letter because you needed to disappear. I answered it because you wrote about feeling like a ghost in your own life. And I knew exactly what you meant." The honesty in her admission should have comforted him, should have made her seem more human and less threatening. Instead, it raised new questions that made his chest tight with unease. Because if she was running from dangerous men, if she was using marriage to him as an escape, then she had brought her troubles to his doorstep. His isolated ranch, his carefully protected solitude, was no longer safe. "What kind of debts?" he asked. Magnolia's jaw tightened. "The kind that don't get forgiven. The kind that get passed down to children when the original debtor can't pay." "How much?" "More than you have. More than anyone has, unless they own a bank or a railroad." Gideon felt the walls of his carefully ordered world beginning to collapse. He had sought a wife to ease his loneliness, and instead, he had invited disaster into his home. A woman with secrets and dangerous men following her trail. Men who might already be looking for her, who might already know where she had gone. The sound of hoofbeats in the distance made them both freeze, faint but unmistakable in the still night air. The hoofbeats grew louder, and Gideon moved to the window, peering through the darkness toward the main road. Magnolia had gone completely still, her face pale in the lamplight, and he could see her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. "How long until they find you?" he asked quietly. "I thought I had more time. I thought the trail would be cold by now." A single horse appeared in the moonlight, moving at a steady pace rather than the urgent gallop of men hunting prey. Gideon squinted at the rider's silhouette and felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. He recognized the horse first, a sturdy bay mare with white stockings, then the slouched posture of the man in the saddle. "It's Otis," he said, and Magnolia's breath came out in a rush of relief. Otis Caldwell was the closest thing Gideon had to a friend, though their relationship consisted mostly of shared silence and occasional assistance with difficult ranch work. The older man lived alone like Gideon, but by choice rather than circumstance, and he had a talent for appearing whenever something was wrong, as if he could sense trouble across the miles of empty land between their properties. Gideon opened the door before Otis could knock, and the weathered man stepped inside, removing his hat and nodding politely at Magnolia. His sharp eyes took in the tension in the room, the cold coffee, the way Magnolia stood pressed against the counter like she expected to need to run. "Evening, Gideon. Ma'am." Otis's voice was gravelly from years of shouting at cattle and talking to himself. "Saw the wagon heading back toward town earlier. Figured your bride had arrived." "She did," Gideon said carefully. "Also saw 3 riders about an hour back, moving hard toward the main road from the east. Didn't recognize them. City clothes, good horses, the kind of men who don't belong out here unless they're looking for something." Magnolia made a small sound, barely audible, and Otis's eyes sharpened as he looked at her more carefully. He was a man who had lived through range wars and cattle rustlers, who could read danger in the set of a person's shoulders or the way they held their hands. "They asking questions in town?" Gideon asked. "Don't know yet, but they were riding like they knew where they were going. And there's only 3 spreads out this direction. Mine, yours, and the abandoned Hartley place." The silence stretched taut between them. Otis was too polite to ask direct questions, but his presence was both a comfort and a complication. If dangerous men were indeed coming for Magnolia, having Otis here meant his friend would be caught in the middle of trouble that wasn't his making. "Otis," Gideon said slowly, "you might want to head home. Get some distance between yourself and whatever's coming." The older man studied both their faces, reading the fear in Magnolia's eyes and the grim determination in Gideon's. Then he settled into a chair at the kitchen table and crossed his arms. "Been a quiet year," he said mildly. "Could use some excitement." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying with it the distant sound of more horses approaching. The approaching horses were closer now, multiple riders moving with purpose through the darkness. Gideon blew out the lamp, plunging the kitchen into moonlit shadows, and motioned for Magnolia to move away from the windows. His rifle hung above the fireplace, loaded and ready, because no man survived alone on the frontier without being prepared for trouble. "How many men are we talking about?" Otis asked quietly, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "At least 3, Magnolia whispered. "Maybe more. They work for Marcus Kellerman, and he doesn't send men who give up easily." Gideon felt his blood chill at the name. Marcus Kellerman was known throughout the territory, a man who owned banks and politicians with equal ease, who collected debts through methods that left families broken and men buried in unmarked graves. If Magnolia's father had borrowed from Kellerman, then the debt wasn't just about money. It was about power, control, and making examples of those who couldn't pay. "What did your father owe him?" Gideon asked. $20,000, maybe more with interest. The number hit like a physical blow. 20,000 was more than most men saw in a lifetime. More than Gideon's ranch was worth even in the best of years. No wonder she had run. No wonder she had answered the desperate letter of a lonely rancher, hoping to disappear into the vastness of the frontier. The sound of horses stopped outside, followed by the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather as men dismounted. Through the window, Gideon could see dark shapes moving around his house, positioning themselves strategically. These weren't random drifters or casual thieves. They were professionals, and they had found their target. A knock came at the door, polite but firm. "Miss Pierce?" a voice called out, cultured and smooth. "We know you're in there. We've traveled a long way to speak with you, and we're not leaving until we do." Magnolia pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her face white with terror. "That's Vincent Harrow, Kellerman's right hand. If he's here personally, it means they're not just collecting a debt anymore." "What else would they want?" Otis asked. "My father didn't just owe money. He had information, documents, things that could destroy Kellerman's business if they fell into the wrong hands." Gideon felt the situation spiraling beyond anything he could control. This wasn't just about protecting a woman from debt collectors. This was about secrets that powerful men killed to protect, documents that could bring down one of the most dangerous men in the territory. "Miss Pierce," the voice came again, closer to the door now. "We're reasonable men. We simply want to conclude our business with your father's estate. If you cooperate, everyone walks away from this. If you don't..." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Gideon looked at his rifle, then at Otis, whose weathered face showed no fear, only the calm readiness of a man who had faced death before and lived to tell about it. "Where are these documents?" Gideon asked Magnolia. She clutched her leather satchel tighter, and he understood. Everything that could destroy Marcus Kellerman was sitting at his kitchen table, carried by a woman who had traveled hundreds of miles to escape men who would kill her for what she knew. The door handle rattled as someone tested it, and Gideon realized that his quiet life, his careful solitude, was about to explode into violence that would change everything. The door handle stopped rattling, and an ominous silence fell over the house. Gideon moved to the window and saw shadows spreading out around the property, men taking positions that would give them clear shots at anyone trying to escape. Vincent Harrow had brought enough firepower to level the entire homestead if necessary. "Miss Pierce," Harrow's voice came again, still polite but with steel underneath. "I'm going to count to 10. If you don't open this door and discuss this like civilized people, my men will open it for you." Magnolia clutched the satchel to her chest, her knuckles white with strain. "The documents in here prove that Kellerman has been stealing from his own bank, using depositors' money to fund illegal land grabs. Names, dates, amounts, everything the territorial government would need to hang him." Gideon understood now why they had come personally, why Vincent Harrow himself was standing on his doorstep with armed men. This wasn't about collecting a debt. This was about survival. If those documents reached the wrong hands, Marcus Kellerman would lose everything, and men like Kellerman didn't lose quietly. 3, Harrow called out. There's a back window, Gideon said quickly. Leads to the corral. If you can make it to the barn, there's a horse already saddled. 4, they'll see me before I reach the corral, Magnolia whispered. 5, Otis stood up slowly, checking his revolver with practiced movements. Been a long time since I was in a proper fight, he said conversationally. Might be fun. 6, Gideon grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace, the weight of it familiar and comforting in his hands. He had fought Apache raiders, cattle thieves, and claim jumpers in his younger years. He knew how to kill when killing was necessary, and looking at Magnolia's terrified face, he decided it was necessary now. 7, when they come through that door, Gideon said quietly, you run for the back window, don't stop, don't look back. Don't. Just run. 8, Magnolia shook her head. I won't let you die for my father's mistakes. 9, your father was trying to stop a criminal, Gideon said. That's not a mistake. That's courage. 10, the front door exploded inward in a shower of splinters, and Vincent Harrow stepped through with a revolver in his hand. Flanked by 2 men with rifles. He was younger than Gideon had expected, maybe 40, with the smooth face and expensive clothes of a man who rarely did his own dirty work. Gentlemen, Harrow said pleasantly, as if he were visiting for Sunday dinner. There's no need for anyone to get hurt here. We simply want what belongs to Mr. Kellerman. Those documents belong to the people he stole from, Magnolia said, stepping out from behind the wall. Harrow's eyes fixed on the satchel in her hands, and his smile turned cold. Your father thought he could play games with powerful men. Look how that worked out for him. The casual cruelty in his voice told Gideon everything he needed to know about how Magnolia's father had died. Not from natural causes, not peacefully. Kellerman had killed him, and now they had come to finish what they started. The lady said no, Gideon said quietly, raising his rifle. Harrow's eyes flicked to him, assessing the threat, calculating odds. This is not your fight, rancher. It is now. The kitchen erupted into violence with the suddenness of lightning. Harrow moved first, bringing his revolver up toward Magnolia, but Gideon was already squeezing the trigger of his rifle. The shot took Harrow in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the wall beside the door. Otis moved with surprising speed for his age, his revolver clearing leather and firing twice in rapid succession. One of Harrow's men dropped immediately, while the other dove for cover behind the overturned table, returning fire wildly. Magnolia ran for the back window as planned, clutching the satchel that contained Marcus Kellerman's destruction. Glass shattered as she kicked out the pane and climbed through, disappearing into the darkness beyond. The remaining gunman rose from behind the table, rifle trained on Gideon, but Otis put a bullet through his heart before he could fire. The man collapsed backward, his weapon clattering across the floor. In the sudden silence that followed, Gideon could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Gunpowder smoke hung thick in the air, and 3 men lay dead in his kitchen, their blood seeping into the wooden floorboards he had laid with his own hands. Vincent Harrow was still alive,